My son texted me, "Don't wait for me on your birthday. I have more important things to do." I celebrated alone. The next morning, I went to the notary. When he found out what I had done. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I turned 72 on a Tuesday in October, and I spent most of that morning doing what I always did, making coffee in the kitchen of the house I had lived in for 41 years, watching the maple tree in the backyard lose its leaves one by one, and waiting for the phone to ring. My name is Margaret Louise Caldwell. People who've known me a long time call me Maggie. I was a high school English teacher for 34 years in Dayton, Ohio. I buried my husband, Robert, 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral, the cruelest kind of goodbye. After that, I kept the house, kept the garden, kept myself busy. I was not the kind of woman who fell apart. Robert always said that about me. "Maggie," he used to say, "you're the kind of person who sweeps up the broken glass before anyone else has even noticed it fell." We had one son, Daniel. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I loved that boy with every cell in my body. I drove him to baseball practice at 6 in the morning for 4 years straight. I stayed up until 2 a.m., helping him apply to colleges. When he called me crying from his first apartment because he didn't know how to cook rice, I drove 40 minutes to show him. I was not a perfect mother. No one is. But I was a present one. I showed up. That was the thing I was most proud of in my life. I always showed up. Daniel married Christine 8 years ago. She was 31, originally from Atlanta, polished in the way that some women are. The kind of polished that takes a lot of effort to maintain and makes everyone around them feel slightly underdressed. She worked in marketing. She had very white teeth and very firm opinions, and from the very first Thanksgiving dinner, I had the distinct feeling that she was measuring me. Not cruelly, not obviously, but measuring. Like she was calculating exactly how much space I was allowed to take up in her husband's life. I told myself I was imagining it. Women my age are trained to say that. "You're being too sensitive, Maggie. You're being one of those mothers-in-law." So I swallowed my unease, and I brought casseroles, and I complimented her curtains, and I babysat their dog when they went to Cancun. The first real sign came 2 years ago, though I didn't recognize it as a sign at the time. Daniel stopped calling on Sundays. For 20 years since he went off to college, Sunday evening was our time. 6 o'clock, give or take. He'd call, we'd talk for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, and I'd go to bed feeling like I still had a son. Then one Sunday, he didn't call, and I waited. And he didn't call the next week either. When I finally reached him, he sounded distracted. "Mom, I've been busy. You know how it is." I did not know how it was, but I said I did. Then came the holidays. The previous Christmas, they'd had plans with Christine's family, which was fine. Families negotiate these things. But Easter passed without a visit. My birthday in October came and went with a card that had Christine's handwriting on it, but only Daniel's name signed inside, as if she'd filled it out and handed it to him to sign, as if my son's own name had become a formality he performed on her schedule. Still, I told myself these were the adjustments of middle age, of marriage, of life getting complicated. I made excuses the way mothers do. Then came this October, my 72nd birthday. I had mentioned it to Daniel in September, casually, not as a demand, just the way you mention things to your child. "My birthday's coming up, maybe we could have dinner." He'd said, "Yeah, Mom, for sure. Let me check with Christine." I should have heard the warning in those words. "Let me check with Christine." As if celebrating his mother's birthday required her approval. I baked my own cake. Yellow cake with chocolate frosting. Robert's recipe. I set the table for two. I'm not sure why I set it for two. Maybe hope is just a reflex at a certain age. I put on a blouse I liked. I waited. At 11:47 in the morning, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A text message from Daniel. Hey, Mom, not going to make it today? Got some stuff going on. Important stuff. Sorry. Happy birthday. I stood in my kitchen, in my good blouse, next to my yellow cake, and I read that message 4 times. Important stuff. I set the phone face down on the counter. I sat down at the table. I ate a slice of my own birthday cake alone in my kitchen, in the house where I had raised him, surrounded by 41 years of a life I had built with my own 2 hands. And I made a decision. I did not cry that evening. I want to be honest about that. Not because I think crying is weakness, but because the absence of tears told me something important. The grief was too old for tears. It had been building for 2 years, quietly, in the background, the way water damage works inside a wall, invisible until the whole thing buckles. I washed my cake dish. I put the leftover slices in a container and set them in the refrigerator. I watered the plant on the windowsill. Then I sat down at Robert's old desk in the study, the roll-top desk he'd had since before we were married, and I did what he always called my accounting. Not money accounting. Life accounting. I got out a yellow legal pad, the kind teachers always have too many of, and I wrote down what I knew. What I knew was this. My son had not visited me in 7 months. The last time I'd seen him in person was in March, at a lunch that Christine had organized. A lunch that felt, in retrospect, less like a family gathering and more like a supervised visit, with Christine steering every conversation away from anything personal and checking her phone twice while I talked. My son had missed my last 2 birthdays in any meaningful sense. Cards signed with his name in her handwriting. A phone call last year that lasted 9 minutes. I know because I timed it afterward, in a moment of small, sad curiosity. My son had stopped asking about my health, my friends, my garden. When I mentioned my knee surgery last spring, he said, "That's rough, Mom," and changed the subject. And there was the house. Robert and I had always been clear between ourselves that the house would go to Daniel when I was gone. It was where Daniel had grown up, where we'd had Christmases and scraped knees and birthday cakes. It was worth a good deal of money now. The neighborhood had changed, as neighborhoods do, and the property had appreciated substantially. I also had savings. Modest, but real. 40 years of a teacher's careful thrift, a life insurance payout from Robert's death, the paid-off house itself, not a fortune by some standards. Enough to matter. I had written a will 11 years ago, the year Robert died. Everything, the house, the savings, all of it, to Daniel. I stared at that legal pad for a long time. Was I being irrational? Was this grief making me dramatic? I turned the question over carefully, the way I'd turned over student essays for 34 years, looking for the actual argument beneath the surface. No, I was not being dramatic. The pattern was too consistent, too deliberate, too coordinated. This was not a son growing distant in the ordinary way that adult children sometimes do. This was a son who had been, and I chose the word precisely, managed. Managed away from me, 1 canceled dinner and 1 9-minute phone call at a time. And I knew who was doing the managing. Christine had never raised her voice at me. She had never been overtly rude. She was far too intelligent for that. What she had done was subtler, the slight rephrasing of things Daniel said about me when she was present. The way gatherings at their house always somehow coincided with my existing commitments. The comments about my neighborhood being a bit of a drive when they lived 40 minutes away. Small things, individually dismissible. Together, they formed a blueprint. I thought about what Robert would have said. He had always had a dry practicality that I'd relied on. I could almost hear him. Maggie, you spent 40 years making sure your students understood that their choices have consequences. Your son is making a choice. Let him understand that too. The next morning, I called my attorney, Howard Bledsoe. Howard had handled Robert's estate and had been our family lawyer for 22 years. He was 70 himself now, still sharp, with an office on 5th Street that smelled of old paper and burned coffee. I'd always trusted him. I need to review my will, I told him. I want to make some changes. He was quiet for a moment. Has something happened, Maggie? Yes, I said. My son texted me happy birthday instead of coming to dinner, and that was just the last thing. Howard understood immediately. He had children of his own. I made an appointment for Friday. That gave me 2 days to get my thoughts in order, to list the changes I wanted, to be certain. I was not going to walk into that office impulsively. I was going to walk in knowing exactly what I was doing and why. I spent those 2 days thinking about the people in my life who had shown up. My neighbor Dorothy, who brought soup when I had the flu in February. My former colleague Ruth, who called every Thursday without exception. My niece in Portland, who sent actual letters, handwritten on stationery, 3 or 4 times a year. People who had demonstrated through small, consistent actions that I was real to them, that I mattered. I also thought about what I owed Daniel. Not the house, not the savings. Those were gifts, not obligations. I thought about whether he deserved a warning, a conversation, a chance to explain himself. And I decided, not yet. Not until I understood more. Not until I had protected myself first. Because I had just realized something that surprised me with its clarity. I had spent my entire adult life protecting everyone else. My students, my husband during his illness, even Daniel. Always Daniel. For the first time in 72 years, I was going to protect myself. I went to bed early, slept deeply, and woke up ready. Friday morning, I drove to Howard's office. Howard Bledsoe's office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building that had been many things over the decades. A dentist's practice, an insurance agency, briefly a photography studio. Now, it was just Howard, with his 2 paralegals and his wall of law books that I was fairly sure he still actually used. I liked that about him. He poured coffee without asking. He knew how I took it. And he sat across from me at his wide oak desk, and he listened without interrupting. I laid it out methodically, the way I used to present a difficult text to a class. Background, evidence, pattern, conclusion. The missed birthdays. The supervised lunch. The 9-minute phone call. The text message. The 2 years of gradual, coordinated withdrawal. When I finished, Howard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want to do, Maggie?" "I want to change my beneficiaries," I said, substantially. We talked through the options for 2 hours. I was not in a position to be reckless. I needed to be practical and fair, even in my anger. What we arrived at was this. I would revise my will to leave the house to a trust, with proceeds directed toward 2 purposes: a scholarship fund at the high school where I had taught for 34 years, and a bequest to Dorothy, Ruth, and my niece Claire, in recognition of relationships that had proven themselves real. A smaller portion, not nothing, but significantly reduced, would go to Daniel, contingent on certain conditions. Not punitive conditions, simply honest ones. The kind that said, "You may still be my son, but inheritance is not a birthright when it goes unearned." Howard drafted the outline while I sat there. I reviewed it carefully, suggested 2 adjustments, and signed the preliminary paperwork. The formal notarized documents would be ready in 10 days. Walking out of that building, into the cold October air, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not guilt, but a plain, grounded calm. Like I had finally put a room in order that had been messy for years. I drove home, made lunch, and graded. Old habit, I still tutored part-time, and said nothing to anyone. What I did not know was that I had already been noticed. Daniel called that evening. Not a text, an actual call, which was unusual enough that I felt a small, instinctive alertness when I saw his name on the screen. "Hey, Mom, just checking in." "That's nice, Daniel. Everything okay?" "Everything's fine. How are you?" The conversation lasted 12 minutes. Longer than usual, warmer in tone, with questions about my knee and my garden that hadn't been asked in months. It was, in its way, a performance. Someone had told him to call. I didn't accuse him of that. I answered his questions pleasantly and let him hang up first. After I set the phone down, I sat still for a moment. How did they know? I hadn't told anyone about my visit to Howard. Then I thought about it more carefully. Howard's paralegal, a young woman named Sasha, had called my house that afternoon to confirm a spelling on a document. It was possible that wasn't the first time she'd called. It was possible Daniel and Christine still had my home number, and possibly even a record of numbers that frequently appeared on my caller ID from the time, years ago now, when Daniel had helped me set up my voicemail and had access to my account settings. I noted this. I did not react, but I filed it. The confirmation came 4 days later, and it was more direct than I expected. I had a routine Tuesday, grocery shopping in the morning, tutoring at 2, the library book club at 5. I parked in front of the library and was reaching for my bag when I noticed a car across the street. A silver sedan I recognized. Christine's car. She was sitting in it, facing my direction, not moving. When she saw me look up, she pulled away immediately. She had been watching where I went. I stood on the sidewalk in the parking lot for a moment, my book bag in my hand, the October wind picking up fallen leaves around my feet. I felt cold, not from the weather. They were worried, not just curious. Worried, which meant they had something to lose, which meant they had been counting on something that they now feared might be slipping. I went into the library book club. I discussed the novel, The Remains of the Day, as it happened, a book about a man who spent his whole life in service to someone unworthy of it. I participated in the discussion with full attention. On the drive home, I called Howard from the car. "Howard, I want to move faster on the documents," I said. "Can we expedite?" "I can have everything ready by Thursday," he said. "Is there a reason for the urgency?" "I believe I'm being watched," I said, "and I'd like the paperwork signed before anyone interferes." A pause. "I'll call Sasha right now," he said. Thursday came. I signed the documents. Everything was notarized, witnessed, filed. My new will was legal, binding, and on record. That evening, I sat in Robert's chair by the window with a glass of wine, and I thought, it's done now. Whatever comes next, it's done. Whatever came next arrived sooner than I expected. I don't know exactly how they found out. I have theories. Perhaps Howard's office had a data breach of some mundane variety. A carelessly opened email, a document name visible on a shared printer. Perhaps Daniel had indeed retained access to some aspect of my accounts and had seen a charge to Bledsoe and Associates. Perhaps Christine, sitting in that silver sedan outside the library, had drawn her own correct conclusions from my behavior. What I know is that 10 days after I signed the revised will, Christine called me directly. Not Daniel, Christine. She called on a Saturday morning at 8:45, which I recognized as a choice. Early enough to catch me before I'd left the house, a small assertion of control. I let it ring twice, then answered. Margaret, she never called me Maggie. We need to talk. Good morning, Christine, I said. I was standing in the kitchen, still in my robe, and I did not move. I stayed planted. Daniel and I have heard some things about changes you might be making to your estate. I noted the word heard, not learned, not discovered. Heard, as if information were simply floating in the air and had drifted to them innocently. I've reviewed my estate planning, yes, I said, as people do. Margaret. Her voice hardened slightly, just slightly, with the precision of someone who had practiced this conversation. I think you know that the house has been understood by everyone to be part of Daniel's future. We've made plans based on... You've made plans, I said, based on an assumption that I had endorsed when circumstances were different. Silence. Then, what does that mean? It means I'm entitled to make my own decisions about my own estate, I said, as I always have been. The temperature in her voice dropped further. I think you should speak with Daniel before you do anything rash. I've already done it, I said. The documents are signed and filed. The silence this time was longer. I could hear her breathing. We will contest this, she said. If someone has influenced you... Howard Bledsoe has been my attorney for 22 years, I said. I am 72 years old. I am in full possession of my faculties, and I made this decision alone. You are welcome to contest whatever you like. That is also your right. She hung up. I set the phone on the counter and stood very still for a moment. My hands were steady. I noticed that particularly. My hands were completely steady. Daniel arrived at my house 40 minutes later. He knocked. He didn't use his key, which told me Christine had advised some restraint. I opened the door. He looked terrible. He was pale, his jaw tight, his eyes carrying that particular expression I recognized from his teenage years. The look of someone who has been sent to do something he doesn't entirely want to do. Mom? Come in, I said. I did not hug him. I stepped back and let him enter. We sat in the living room, the room where he'd grown up, where his school photos still hung on the wall, where I had read to him at night until he was old enough to be embarrassed by it. He looked at those photos once, briefly, and then looked away. He said what Christine had scripted. He said I was acting emotionally. He said I was making a permanent decision based on a bad day. He said he was sorry about the birthday, that he should have called, that things had been complicated. He said, and this was the part I found most painful, that Christine only wanted what was best for their family, that she had never been anything but supportive of me, that I had misread the situation. I let him finish. Then I said, Daniel, I did not make this decision because of a bad day. I made it because of 2 years of evidence, and the fact that the first contact I received after filing legal documents was from Christine, not you, tells me everything I need to know about where the decisions in your household are made. He flushed. He started to say something. He stopped. I love you, I said. That has not changed. But love is not an inheritance, and an inheritance is not unconditional. He left without raising his voice, which I respected even then. I closed the door and leaned against it in the hallway for a long moment. Then I called Dorothy next door and asked if she wanted to take a walk. We walked for an hour through the neighborhood, talking about her daughter's new baby and the frost that was coming for the garden. I said nothing about Daniel. Sometimes what you need is the ordinary world. Over the next 3 days, I gave myself rest. I slept. I watched old films I loved. I called Claire in Portland. I did not answer 2 more calls from Christine's number, and I replied to a follow-up text from Daniel with, "I'm taking a few days. I'll call you next week." I needed the stillness. What came next would require everything I had. The first attempt at temptation was elegant, I'll admit that. Christine was too intelligent for crude approaches. It came through a third party, Daniel's aunt on his father's side, Robert's younger sister Frances, who lived in Cincinnati and whom I'd always had an amiable but not close relationship with. Frances called on a Wednesday evening, her voice carefully casual, and worked around to the subject with the particular indirectness of someone who has been asked to make a call but doesn't want to admit it. "I've been talking to Daniel," she said. "He's very upset, Maggie. Very worried about you. He said you've been making some unusual decisions lately." "Reviewing my estate planning is unusual?" I said. "He said it came out of nowhere, that you seemed," he used the word confused. There it was. Confused. I had been expecting something like it. In the state of Ohio, a will can be contested on grounds of diminished mental capacity. It's not easy to prove, but the attempt itself can be costly, stressful, and damaging to a person's dignity. What they were doing, I understood clearly, was laying a foundation. Building a narrative, an elderly widow acting erratically, easily influenced, possibly confused. It was, in its way, sophisticated. "Frances," I said, "I taught high school English for 34 years. I hold a master's degree. I do the New York Times crossword every morning. And I made these decisions after 2 hours of consultation with an attorney I've worked with for over 2 decades. I am not confused. I'm angry. There's a difference." A pause. Then, more quietly, "I'm just passing along what he said, Maggie." "I know you are," I said. "Tell him I'll call him next week as I promised. But tell him this. If anyone attempts to challenge the legal validity of my will on grounds of incapacity, I will ensure my physician and my attorney are both prepared to testify at length." Frances didn't call back, but the exchange left me alert. I needed reinforcements. Not emotional support only, but structural support. The kind that makes clear to anyone who might be watching that a person is not alone. I called Howard the next morning. "They may attempt a capacity challenge," I told him. "I want to get ahead of it." Howard, bless him, was already ahead of it. He suggested 2 things. First, that I request a routine cognitive assessment from my physician. Not because I needed to prove anything to myself, but because having it on record would neutralize any challenge immediately. Second, that I write a detailed, dated personal statement explaining the reasoning behind my estate changes, in my own words, in my own voice, to be kept with the will. I did both. The cognitive assessment was administered the following Tuesday by Dr. Patricia Huang, my physician of 8 years. I scored in the top quartile for my age group. Dr. Huang, who had heard the summary of the situation and whose expression told me she had seen this before, handed me the results personally and said, "You are one of the sharpest patients I have." I thanked her and made a copy of the report before I left the office. The personal statement took me an afternoon to write. I wrote it at Robert's desk on the same yellow legal pad I'd used on the night of my birthday. I wrote 3 pages. Clear, specific, chronological. Every missed occasion. Every 9-minute phone call. The supervised lunch. Christine's car outside the library. The call from Frances. I wrote it the way I wrote lesson plans. Organized, evidenced, free of self-pity. I signed and dated every page. Howard had it notarized and filed with the estate documents the following day. That afternoon, I went to Dorothy's house for coffee. Dorothy was 74, a retired nurse, sharp as a pin, and one of the people I had included in my revised will. Something she didn't know yet, and something I didn't tell her now. I simply needed her company. We sat at her kitchen table and I told her, in broad terms, what was happening. I didn't dramatize it. I laid it out the way I had for Howard. Here is the situation. Here is what I've done. Here is where I stand. Dorothy listened without interrupting. Also, a quality of good nurses and good teachers. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Maggie, Robert always said you were the strongest person he knew, and he was not a man who handed out compliments." I looked out her window at the street we'd both lived on for decades. "I'm not trying to punish Daniel," I said. "I want you to know that." "I know," she said. "You're protecting yourself. That's not punishment. That's survival." I drove home in the early evening, through streets lined with bare trees and the last orange leaves, and I felt not happy exactly, but solid, grounded in something real. The kind of feeling that comes when you have done the right things in the right order and you know it. I also felt, for the first time in weeks, genuinely unafraid. Let them come. They came on a Sunday. I should have anticipated it. Sunday had always been, in our family, the day for things that mattered. Robert proposed to me on a Sunday. Daniel was born on a Sunday. They would have known, somewhere in the logic of family symbolism, that Sunday was the day to make a gesture. They arrived at 11 in the morning, just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee. I heard Christine's car first. I had learned the particular sound of her engine in the way you learn the sounds of things that concern you. Then Daniel's knock. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. He had knocked on doors that way since he was a teenager, and hearing it now, standing in my own hallway, I felt the specific ache of a thing that is both familiar and no longer simple. They were dressed well, not formally, but carefully. The kind of Sunday presentable that says we have made an effort. Christine carried a bakery box, pastries from the expensive French place near their house that I had always privately liked. It was, from a tactical standpoint, a well-chosen detail. Someone had thought carefully about what might soften me, and they had been right about the croissants, even if they were wrong about everything else. "We wanted to talk," Daniel said at the door. "Without arguing, just talk." I looked at them both for a moment. Christine's expression was composed, open even, in the particular way of someone who has practiced openness in a mirror. Daniel looked more genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty was, I knew, the most dangerous thing in the room, because it was real, and real things pull at you in ways that performances cannot. I stepped back and let them in. We sat in the living room. Christine set the pastries on the coffee table and opened the box with a small, domestic ease, as if she had always been comfortable in my home, as if the previous 2 months had not happened. She had bought my favorites, almond croissants. She had remembered or had made it her business to find out. I noted this. Daniel spoke first. His tone was the one I recognized from his most sincere moments. Quieter, slower, the way he'd talked to me after Robert died when he was trying to hold himself together. He said he was sorry. He said the birthday had been a mistake, that Christine had had a family obligation. Her mother, he said, had needed them that day, and that he should have called me earlier, explained, not sent a text. He said he'd been a bad son recently, and he knew it. He said he loved me. I listened, and I noticed the things I was supposed to notice: the familiar voice, the specific apology, the almond croissants. I also noticed the things I was perhaps not supposed to notice. Christine had said nothing yet. When Daniel finished, I asked gently, "And what was the family obligation, Daniel?" With Christine's mother, a flicker across his face. the micro expression of someone accessing a prepared answer rather than a real memory. She had a doctor's appointment. She needed company. On my birthday? I said. A Tuesday? She doesn't always schedule things conveniently, Mom. I nodded as if I accepted this. Then I turned to Christine. She was ready. She had been waiting, with the patience of someone who has rehearsed. She told me she had always respected me. She told me she had never tried to come between Daniel and me, that she had encouraged their relationship, that she had always spoken highly of you to Daniel. She said she was hurt by the estate changes. Not for herself, she said, but for Daniel, who deserved to know his mother hadn't turned against him. She said she hoped we could find a way forward. She paused here, letting the sincerity settle in the room like perfume. Deliberate, invisible, designed to be absorbed before you noticed it had been released. Then she said, and this was the thing that told me everything, the thing I will never forget. She said, Margaret, if you simply restore the original arrangements, we can put all of this behind us. We can start fresh. Simply restore. I set down my coffee cup. Christine, I said, I want to make sure I understand you. You're saying that if I change my will back to what it was before, if I remove the scholarship fund, the bequests to my friends, the protections I put in place for myself, then we can have a relationship again. She hesitated, a very small hesitation. That's not what because that is what you said, I told her. Simply restore the original arrangements. Those were your exact words. Daniel was looking at Christine now. Something shifted in his face. A slight confusion. The look of a man who has just heard something from his wife's mouth that doesn't quite align with the version of events he's been living inside. I'm not going to restore anything, I said. I kept my voice even, not cold, not angry, simply certain. What I have done is legal, considered, and final. It reflects real choices I've made based on real things that happened. I love you, Daniel. I have always loved you. But I will not be asked to purchase my son's presence with my estate. Christine stood. The warmth evaporated immediately, cleanly, the way a stage light goes off. There was no gradual cooling, no transition. One moment she was composed and open. The next she was simply done pretending. And the difference between those two states was so stark, it was almost clarifying. You're making a terrible mistake, she said. You're going to be alone, Margaret. You're going to regret this. Maybe, I said, but it will be my mistake to make. They left. Daniel paused at the door, turned back, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Not anger. Something more complicated. Grief, maybe. Loss. The look of someone who has arrived at a doorway and cannot see clearly what is on either side of it. I held his gaze and didn't flinch, and the door closed. I stood in my living room for several minutes without moving. The bakery box was still open on the coffee table. The almond croissants sat in their paper cups, untouched. Christine's last words, "You're going to be alone," circled in my chest with a cold, small weight. Because that fear of aloneness, of having miscalculated, of having thrown away my son over a principle, that fear was real. I will not pretend otherwise. It sat in my sternum like a stone, and I breathed around it. But beneath it, steadier and deeper, was something else. The knowledge that what she had offered was not a relationship. It was a transaction. Give us the inheritance, and we will give you access to your son. That was the offer, stripped of the croissants and the practiced warmth and the Sunday timing. And no fear of aloneness, however real, was great enough to make me accept it. I washed the coffee cups. I ate one almond croissant. It was excellent, as it always was, and I saw no reason to waste it. I left the rest on the counter. Then I called Howard and told him what had happened. "Document it," he said immediately. "Write down exactly what she said, word for word, with the date and time." I already had my legal pad out. The meeting that changed everything happened in January, 2 months after the Sunday visit. It was Howard's idea, and it was a good one. He suggested, after reviewing the pattern of events, the documentation I'd been compiling, and a letter Christine had made the significant mistake of sending to his office, that we bring everything together in one place. An informal meeting, Daniel, Christine, Howard, and me at Howard's office. Civil, legal, on record. The kind of meeting, Howard explained without saying it plainly, that would make very clear to all parties exactly how much documentation existed and exactly how futile any legal challenge would be. Christine's letter to Howard had been sent in December. It was 3 pages, single-spaced, and it outlined what she described as concerns about my mental state and vulnerability to outside influence. She had cited, as evidence, my sudden and irrational estate changes, my increasingly reclusive behavior, and what she called troubling reports from family members, Francis presumably, about my cognitive state. She had not sent the letter as a legal filing. It appeared she had sent it as a shot across the bow, a warning, a way of establishing a paper trail before a formal challenge. What she had not accounted for was that Howard would share it with me, or that I would then share it with my physician and add it to the documentation file. She had written a letter she believed only one person would read. Instead, it had become an exhibit. Howard scheduled the meeting for the second Tuesday in January. I spent the week before it not in preparation, exactly, but in a kind of mental quiet. I had prepared all I needed to prepare. The documents were in order. The evidence was filed. The arguments were made. What remained was simply to show up and be who I was. I slept well. I worked in the garden on the warmer days, cutting back the dead growth from autumn. I read. I cooked real meals. I was, as Robert would have said, ready in my bones. The morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully. Not to impress, but to be precisely myself. A dark green blazer I'd had for years. Good earrings. The watch Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary. Gold face. Simple band. The kind of watch that marks time without making any fuss about it. I looked at myself in the mirror before I left and I thought, this is what 72 looks like when it is not ashamed of itself. I drove to 5th Street, parked, walked up the stairs without hurrying. Daniel and Christine were already there when I arrived, seated across from Howard's desk. Christine was in a crisp gray suit. Daniel was beside her, and he had the look of a man who has been managed right up to the edge of his own uncertainty. Present in body, somewhere else in mind. His jaw set in the particular way of someone who is trying to decide, in real time, what he actually believes. I sat, Howard began. He laid out the situation with a methodical clarity I had always admired in him. The original will, the revised will, the legal validity of the revision, supported by all documentation, including the cognitive assessment, the physician's report, and the personal statement. He explained that all challenges on grounds of incapacity would face this documentation as an immediate counter. He explained the timeline, the process, the outcomes. His voice was calm, unhurried, the voice of a man who has seen many rooms like this one and has never needed to raise it. Then quietly, he slid a copy of Christine's letter across the desk. "We received this in December," Howard said. "I want to address the concerns it raises." Christine's expression did not change. She was very good at stillness. "The letter alleges diminished capacity," Howard continued. I would like to enter into the record that Mrs. Caldwell's physician has assessed her cognitive function as excellent for her age group. I would also like to note that this letter was written by a party who stands to benefit significantly from a successful challenge to the existing will. This creates an obvious conflict of interest that any court would consider. Daniel turned and looked at Christine. You wrote a letter to her lawyer? It was a precaution, Christine said smoothly. I was concerned about... You told me you were going to send a letter to Aunt Frances, he said. His voice was quiet, but something in it had shifted. A tectonic thing, small on the surface, deep underneath. You said it was to Aunt Frances, to check in on her. Daniel, did you drive to the library? He said. He was looking at her directly now with an expression I had not seen on his face in years, clear, unmanaged, his own. That day in October, did you go and watch Mom at the library? I happened to be in that area. Christine, the word landed plainly in the room. Not angry, more like an arriving conclusion. The last piece of a thing clicking into place. Christine pivoted. She was practiced enough to pivot. She turned to me and said, Margaret, everything I have done has been to protect Daniel. He is not equipped to manage a large estate. He has never been good with money. You know that. If the house and the assets go through you without proper planning, in 10 years he will have nothing. I was trying to protect him. From me, I said. From his own mother, I said. You were protecting him from his mother. She opened her mouth and closed it again. And for the first time since I had known Christine, across 8 years of holidays and lunches and carefully orchestrated family occasions, she had nothing prepared. The sequence she had mapped out had collapsed. Daniel was not where she'd placed him. I was not reacting as she'd scripted. Howard was not a neutral witness, but an active presence with a file full of her own words. The room was not the room she'd entered, and Christine, without her script, was smaller than I expected. Not weak, but ordinary. Human. A woman who had wanted something badly enough to lose herself pursuing it, and who was only now beginning to understand what that had cost her. Christine, I said, still even, still quiet. You have spent years systematically limiting my access to my son. Not with cruelty, you were too careful for that, but with consistent, calibrated effort. Scheduling conflicts. Subtle redirection. A campaign to paint me as confused, difficult, elderly. Enlisting family members. Sitting outside my library. And when none of that was enough, a letter to my attorney alleging incapacity. Written by someone who has never attended a single appointment with my physician, never assessed my mental state in any professional capacity, and who stands to inherit significantly if my current will is overturned. The room was very quiet. I am not confused, I said. I have never been confused. I simply finally saw clearly. Daniel was looking at his hands. He was very still, as people are when something they have been not thinking about for a long time finally becomes something they cannot avoid thinking about. Christine stood. You are twisting everything. You have always resented me. You have never accepted that Daniel chose me and chose his own life, and you cannot stand that he built something without you. Christine, sit down, Daniel said. She stopped. He said it again, quietly, with the tone of a man who has only just remembered that he is allowed to have a tone. Sit down. She sat. Daniel looked at me then. For the first time in 2 years, without her beside the words, without the managed script, without the careful architecture of a life that had been built partly around keeping these two women from speaking plainly to each other. He looked at me the way he used to. Uncertain and sorry and very young, in the way children are always young to their parents, no matter how old they get, no matter what has passed between them. "Mom," he said, "I'm sorry." Those were the two words that had the power to break me, and I will tell you honestly, they nearly did. They moved through me like something physical, like a key turning in a lock I had not known was still there. I felt my throat tighten, and I let it tighten, and I did not look away from him. But I had also heard Christine's letter read aloud in this room. And I had also stood alone in my kitchen in my good blouse next to my birthday cake on a Tuesday in October. "I know," I said. The meeting ended without drama. That was, perhaps, its own kind of drama. Christine did not contest the will. Howard had made the obstacles to such a challenge very clear, and Christine was, above everything else, a practical woman. A capacity challenge with a full cognitive report, a physician's testimony, a detailed personal statement, and a 22-year attorney relationship would fail expensively and publicly. She was not willing to take that bet. She and Daniel left together, but the walking together quality of it had changed. I watched from Howard's third-floor window as they crossed the parking lot. They moved like two people in different rooms of the same house. Howard and I sat for a moment after they left. He poured more coffee. The old building settled around us. "It'll hold, Maggie," he said. "Everything you've put in place, it'll hold." "I know," I said. He nodded. "For what it's worth. In 22 years, I've never seen anyone handle something like this with more clarity." I thanked him and drove home. In the weeks that followed, the revised will stood unchanged. No legal challenge was filed. Francis called once more in February, and I was pleasant and brief and unmoved. 2 letters arrived from Christine, one in January, one in March, both of which I gave to Howard without reading in full. He noted their contents for the record and confirmed they contained no actionable legal claims. Daniel called me 3 weeks after the meeting. He called on a Sunday evening at 6 o'clock, the old time. "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything right now," he said. "I just wanted to call." "That's all right," I said. We talked for 31 minutes. I know because I looked at the clock after, and I felt the difference from 9 minutes the way you feel the difference between a closed window and an open one. He did not ask about the will. He did not mention Christine. He asked about my knee and whether the frost had gotten the roses and whether I was still tutoring the Henderson boy on Thursday afternoons. Ordinary things. Real things. The vocabulary of a person finding their way back to a language they'd almost forgotten. I answered everything honestly. I did not punish him with warmth. I was genuinely glad to hear from him. But I did not pretend, either, that we were already where we might someday be again. Trust is not a light switch. It is more like a garden. If you don't tend it, you cannot simply resume where you left off. "Mom," he said near the end of the call, was it really for that long?" I knew what he was asking. "Yes," I said, "for a long time." Silence. Then, "I think I knew some of it. I think I told myself other explanations." "People do," I said. "It's easier." "I'm sorry I chose easy," he said. I sat with that for a moment. Outside, the January night was clear and cold, and the maple tree in the backyard was bare and very still. "You can choose differently now," I said. "That's all." We said goodnight. I sat for a long while after in Robert's chair, thinking about nothing in particular, just the quality of the evening, the way the house felt around me. Not lonely, but inhabited, full of my own life. The will remained what it was. The scholarship fund for the high school where I'd taught. The bequests to Dorothy, Ruth, and Claire. A reduced and conditional provision for Daniel. Not nothing, not punitive, but honest. A reflection of the relationship as it actually was, not as I had once hoped it would be. I had not won something spectacular. I want to be clear about that. I had not triumphed in any way that would look good in a film. What I had done was simpler and harder. I had looked at my life clearly, made decisions that reflected what was actually true, and held to them when I was pressured to abandon them. That, in the end, felt like enough. Spring came late that year, but it came beautifully, all at once, as if the world had been holding its breath. I replanted the rose bed along the back fence. Dorothy came over 2 Saturdays in a row to help, and we worked in comfortable silence, the kind that takes decades of friendship to build. Marcus Henderson got a B+ on his English exam in April, the first of that grade he'd ever received. He texted me a photo with the grade circled. I printed it and put it on the refrigerator next to a postcard from Claire in Portland. I started attending a poetry lecture series at the public library. 8 Tuesday evenings, modern American verse. I had forgotten the pleasure of a room full of people paying close attention to language. I went alone. I took notes. I had strong opinions. It was delightful. Daniel visited in April. Just Daniel. We ate lemon chicken outside for the first time that year. Still a little cold, but both of us wanting the ordinary dignity of a meal at the same table. We talked about his work, my tutoring, a documentary he'd seen. At the end of the afternoon, he hugged me at the door and said he'd come back in May. He came back in May. And in June. The trust was not restored. Trust of that kind does not restore in 3 visits. But something real was beginning, in the direction of what a relationship between a mother and a son ought to be. Not managed, not supervised. Just 2 people finding their way back to what belonging to each other meant. Christine had filed for divorce in March. I did not feel triumph. Daniel's pain was not something I could be glad about. But the architecture of a marriage built on control will not survive once the controlled person begins to see it clearly. Daniel told me himself in May, quietly and factually. He said he had been willing, for a long time, to not look too closely. That was his accountability, and I respected him for it. Christine relocated to Atlanta by summer. I do not wish her ill. I wish her the growth that comes from difficulty, the most honest form of goodwill I can offer. My life had become something I was genuinely grateful for. A son who called every Sunday. Dorothy and Ruth. The poetry lectures and the rose bed and Robert's chair by the window and the maple tree, losing its leaves each October and growing them back each April. Above all, I had the knowledge that I had looked at my own life clearly and acted accordingly. There is a particular freedom in that, one I had not expected to discover at 72. The freedom of having tested your own judgment and found it sound. Robert would have been insufferably pleased with me, and that thought made me smile every time it arrived. So I'll ask you, what would you have done, standing in that kitchen, in your good blouse, reading that text message next to your birthday cake? I'd love to know. Leave your answer in the comments. Share this story if it moved you. And thank you, genuinely, for sitting with me through all of it. Some stories need to be told. This was one of mine,